Hi guys, welcome to this month's webinar. So now you know. Today we're going to be discussing, well, more like navigating the labor landscape of remote work, because this is a relatively new phenomenon that is taking the employment industry by storm, both in South Africa and globally. So I'm just going to be chatting to you from a perspective of employer and employee, and what some key considerations are what the key considerations are to keep in mind when you are assessing whether remote work is for you or not for you. I'm Rishni Ibrahim. I am a commercial associate here at Nignis, as well as the head of labor, and I'm running today's webinar, as you can see. Okay, cool. So today we are going to cover a few things. First, we're going to look at some of the advantages and disadvantages of remote work. It's important to understand both sides of a coin before we delve into the employment considerations, employment policies and expectations, how you structure hybrid work policies or remote work policies, and whether international employees and foreign employers hiring South African employees are they are bound by South African law or not, and we'll look at why. And there's also a little bit of a tax implication that is on the horizon with that aspect. Okay, cool. So some of the advantages and disadvantages of remote work. So in terms of the employer, there's reduced costs such as property and rental servicing costs, less overheads to look out for. You technically have a healthier and happier workforce. You have to, there's like an IT and systems upskilling that maybe it's something you are long overdue to do. There's an increased productivity and job satisfaction between your staff. There is an attraction with your company in that you are able to not only get more people into your business to work for you, and you are able to retain a more diverse workforce, because let's face it, remote work is a very attractive perk of the job. There's also an improved trust and working relationship between employer and employee. In terms of the employee's perspective, there's better work-life balance, which a lot of people are opting for nowadays. There's also the room for flexibility in that it's not so rigid that you have to be in your seat by 8 or 9 o'clock every morning and then you leave at 5. There's more flexibility to do more things before work and after work, allowing for the greater work-life balance. And there's also reduced commuting time and costs, and we all know the cost of petrol nowadays is insane. So that is also a nice advantage to remote work. There's greater autonomy in terms of you are in charge of your tasks. This is what you need to do. You see it to make sure it gets done, less micromanaging. Fewer distractions. I mean, we all know when everyone's in the office, it can be quite distracting in that we all want to catch up. We want to know what's going on in everyone's lives and just have a quick break and a quick chat here or there. Again, there's IT and systems upskilling, which some employers are long overdue for. And there's an increased productivity on the employee side. So there's also the disadvantages of remote work. We know that to every advantage is a disadvantage. So as you can see, from the part of the employer, there's reduced control and oversight over employees, which can lead to more stricter monitoring processes and micromanaging, which also affects the relationship and the trust between the employer and employee. It's harder to train your staff because if everyone is working remotely, how do you conduct those trainings? It's harder to maintain company cohesion and culture. It does create a little bit of a rift between management and staff. Workers may begin to see it as a right, but that's something we will touch on in the employment considerations coming up. Companies have to invest more time and resources into making sure that they have the equipment available and the software and platforms available for their employees to do their job while they're working remotely. There's also an increased risk to data privacy and cybersecurity. And it's, the one that we all know and dread, load shedding. How do we navigate around that going forwards? And in terms of the employee, disadvantages is that there's lack of visibility to management, lack of a workspace and requirements when it comes to working at home. Like, do you have the designated space to sit down and perform your duties? Do you have the equipment and resources to perform your job adequately? There could be more distractions in that you don't live in a house or an apartment or space that gives you the privacy and gives you the quiet that you need to perform your work. There could be other family members in and out all around you all the time. There's often a blurring between work and home space and time. People find it difficult to switch off at the end of the day and clock out and make sure that there's that divide between work and personal time. There's increased bills into utility, equipment, meaning that you would have to go and buy equipment that you never had before, which could be costly. Again, micromanagement and excessive monitoring because of the trust and the distrust and tension between the employer and employee. And also, like, people don't end up taking their leave when they're supposed to. Like, they view it as them just being sick and working at home. They can do both, but if you're sick, you should be taking your annual leave. I'm not your annual leave, it's sick leave. Sorry about that. There's obviously a greater demand and an adoption for remote working kind of entitlements. So it is very important to keep these advantages and disadvantages in mind when you are planning to implement a policy or planning to implement this new hybrid work structure with your company, if you haven't already done so. Employment considerations. So just look at a few employment considerations to take into, to just bear in mind when you are implementing a hybrid work policy or hybrid work structure in the workplace. So let's look at how it came about, right? We all know hybrid working or remote working came because of COVID-19. COVID-19 forced employers to work, the pandemic forced employers to find different ways to force employers to find different ways and to keep the businesses going, to keep making sure that the operations are still functional, the money is coming in, no one is losing their jobs, adapting basically. So the workplace as we know it is like the traditional workplace as we know it in office is rapidly evolving and has rapidly evolved actually to date. And it's unlikely that it's ever going to return to its former state, which is everyone back in office. It's very unlikely that everyone's going to go back to that full time. Some people are already doing it. Some people are opting for the hybrid kind of work structure, or they are just letting people work remotely because it works for them. Obviously, it depends on the type of work it's do. So it's not a one shoe fits every, it's not a one size fits all kind of situation. It's definitely what's going to work for you and what's not going to work for you. But as we know it, the workplace is no longer just in the sense of coming to the office and going home at the end of the day. The workplace is evolving. It's now extended to the home. Yeah. So although we move from the move to remote work or home working is generally considered like a win for employees and employers, there are implications and for traditional employee benefits such as car and travel allowances. How is that managed and regulated? Information security and data privacy, how is that regulated? The implications for the health and safety and compliance matters on both the employer and the employees side, because employers also need to grapple with how to deal with all of this in the from a traditional sense in the law, and how it spills over into the home place as well. So what does this new practice of hybrid working or remote work mean for employers and employees? There are two main legal principles that employees would need to consider when moving towards implementing a structure like this in the workplace. Basically, firstly, any desired changes that you as an employer wish to make must be done both fairly, procedurally fairly, and it must be substantively fair. which means that the reason and the way it's the reason for the change and the way the change is made must be fair. And oftentimes this is done by consulting with your employees and making them aware of the intended, changes that are up and coming. If there's any feedback from them, listening to them and engaging with them, making sure that they are aware as to why this is coming about. Not that it's going to stop you from doing it, but it shows that you have taken them into consideration. It's important to know that remote work, and firstly, most importantly, actually, it's a remote work and hybrid work structure is not a right in terms of the law. It's not an entitlement afforded you in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act as an employee, and it's not an obligation for an employer to have a structure like this in place. It's more of at your employee's discretion. However, if it is something that has been happening for some time, it could be argued that is essentially become the employee's right. But generally, in terms of the law, it's not a right. So I'm sorry, guys, you cannot go to an employer and demand remote work. Then there's the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and everything that it regulates. It's still something that employees are entitled to at home. So like I said, the workspace is no longer just in the office, it's extending beyond the office. And therefore, those rights are extending beyond the office, and the employers must be well aware of that even though people are working from home and it looks like they're comfortable and, not in the traditional sense of going to work, employees are still entitled to their annual leave, they're still entitled to their sick leave, family responsibility leave, and everything else that comes with the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, but we're not going to get too deep into that today. Just on that point, by normalizing remote work, right, there has been some calls for amendments to the labor laws to explicitly outline provisions for remote working, by including a clear definition of what this entails, the rights, the responsibilities of both employers and employees in these arrangements, and addressing issues such as working hours, leave, and data security, so that it doesn't have to be regulated in a policy, but it would be then regulated by law. It's just an extra layer of protection for everyone involved. But we'll see when that happens. Will take some time before government or the legislature does get to even reviewing that and amending it. Another thing that you need to consider is that if you as an employer wish to change your structure to a fully remote one, or even a hybrid structure, you should be mindful of the employees who may not have the means at their home setting or their place of remote work, the infrastructure, the equipment, the space to perform their job adequately, and then they would have to make contingency plans for circumstances like that. It would be quite unfair to expect people to work from home if they cannot do so adequately. In that sense, the workplace would be in the office. Okay, cool. Let's look at employment policies and expectations. There are a few things to consider if your company wants to offer full-time remote work or just hybrid structures to employees. A few of these considerations to take into to bear in mind as an employer is that before you do so, review your employment contracts that you have in place and to ascertain whether it creates a setting for remote work. If not, you could amend your existing employment, but you could amend your employment contracts so it can be used to accommodate future employees that are brought on. You can amend existing employment contracts to include this, but remember, if you do so, you are changing material term of an employment agreement. You would need the consent of the employee to do so. That's why a lot of employers don't go that route. They rather implement this via a policy so that it applies to all. Like I said, review and update existing policies regarding remote work or draft policies to govern remote work. Your policies should be as comprehensive as possible in that it takes various aspects into account, but we'll get into that later on. When it comes to implementing changes in general, like I said, employers should ensure that these are implemented fairly across the board. The policies should touch on, your hybrid work policy should touch on data and security safeguards, because as you're aware, POPI is very much there in the background, and it's something to have in mind as well. It's also something that is at risk when employees are working from home. The parameters and expectations that you would like to set for your employees is very important. In terms of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the requirements that are placed, the obligations that are placed on employers in terms of this act, as I said, doesn't just end in the workplace, the traditional workplace, it extends beyond that. So even though your employees are now working at home, you have to ensure that you're able to accommodate in that sense as well, and fulfill your obligations in that sense as well. You need to consider the equipment and the resources that are required and the usage terms thereof, and training and performance monitoring and reviews. It's also something that you need to maybe consider implementing as well, because you won't be in office, or you won't be in the same space all the time. How do you counteract that? You have a comprehensive policy in place governing how that will work. It would be best practice for an employer to document how all of this is going to regulate the employment relationship going forward, especially when the employee is working from home. I just want to touch on this little thing called the right to disconnect. It's also another thing that should be taken into account if the remote work and hybrid structure is to become a normalized way of working. What the right to disconnect basically means is that employees have the right after a working day to just disconnect from work, not bring work home, no overtime, just to kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, disconnect. Just the right to disconnect. Like I said earlier, one of the disadvantages of working from home is that there's a blurred line between the work and the personal time, the work time and the personal time, the workspace and the personal space, especially when you're working from home. So the right to disconnect means you're disengaging from that. And it is there has been a global debate on whether this right should be something that is formally implemented with all the governments around the world. France was actually one of the first countries to enact this right, and many other countries followed suit. If you look at the trend, it's mostly first world countries that have followed suit because they're able to do so and afford to do so. And South Africa has not yet considered this, and I don't think they will consider this anytime soon, because we are not considered a third world country, and we still have a long way to go in terms of our employment. There's a lot of unemployed people. There's a lot of people who lack the skills, or highly skilled people are leaving the country. So we have competition with first world countries. That's why this right, I feel that this right may not be considered anytime soon, just so that we can make up for the shortfall that we have in competition with first world countries. Even though this right is not maybe something that will be engaged with anytime soon, there is still a right of overtime pay in terms of the basic conditions of Employment Act. It kind of touches on the right to disconnect for people earning below the earning threshold, which is about 240,000 Rand per annum. If you earn below the threshold, you qualify for overtime. If you earn above the threshold, you don't qualify for overtime pay. So yeah, the basic conditions of employment that kind of touches on that, but I think it's an interesting topic to maybe just bear in mind when it comes to remote work and hybrid work structures, the right to disconnect, and how that is going to affect employees and employers later on down the line. Let's look at the hybrid work policies. A few things for you to take into account if you are going to draft your own hybrid work policies, just things such as when are the in-office days, when are the remote work days, is it a set structure, is it going to differ from time to time, what are the minimum thresholds relating to the work and your employees' productivity, what are the core working hours, because now the core working hours, that also kind of blurs with remote work. When are people supposed to start working and when are they supposed to clock off, like, and how do you stick to those core working hours rather than just starting earlier and ending later because people can. Places, what are the places for remote work? Must it be at the employee's house? Can they work at a co-working space? What are the requirements around that? The equipment for remote work, who's going to give that? The employer often does that, provides that to the employee, but in certain circumstances, they might give them, like, you might want to give your employee a grant or to cover the cost of the equipment that they need to perform their remote work. You need to have some very strict and comprehensive terms around confidentiality and data protection, because obviously if you have other people in the house and your employee is just leaving their laptop open or leaving their work open, people who are not allowed to view the work will be privy to the information. How do you combat that? How do you regulate that? So definitely have something as comprehensive as possible. What systems of communication do you prefer? Do you prefer everyone communicate on WhatsApp in a group? Or do you prefer everyone communicate over Teams or Slack or email? It's better to choose one form of communication rather than having different forms of communication, because it can get a little bit chaotic. And also think about the software that you need to monitor your employees' performance and how you manage your employees' performance while they're not in the same space as you. What are the load shedding requirements? Because obviously load shedding is not going away anytime soon. Are your employees obliged to make sure that they have backups in place? Are you going to provide those backups to them? What are the contingency plans if it fails, or they fail to have those backups in place? Is there a place for them to come to at the end of the day if they can't, if they can't have that equipment in place to ensure that they do their duties? And yeah, communicating your needs. How do you plan on doing that when you're not all in the same space? Another thing that you need to take into account when you're putting together your policy is staff training. How do you manage requests for hybrid working or remote days? How are you going to implement the hybrid working system? Again, it comes down to the core hours and managing a schedule. What are the skills that are necessary to lead and manage your staff remotely? You need to train your managers, you need to train your supervisors, make sure that they are able to handle their team while their team is working remotely, because it's not as easy when you don't have sight of the person in front of you. And it's very important to encourage collaboration and good working relationships, because again, you don't want to break down the trust and you don't want to cause tension between the employer and the employees, or just between employees in general. How are the managers or the supervisors gonna manage staff performance? It's all these things you have to take into account, because at the end of the day, you want people to know exactly what they need to do at the end of the day, and not leave it up to them to assume or make their own decisions and run into problems later down the line. Again, employee monitoring due to the lack of oversight and visibility. How your employees going to make sure that their performance and their productivity is kept at the standard that's required of them? And how do you, that needs to be balanced with micromanaging, because with micromanaging comes distrust, and you want to keep the good working relationship, and you want to keep the company cohesion and company culture as positive as possible. Because whether we like it or not, being isolated from your team can kind of cause a little bit of rift. At the end of the day, how do you combat that? That's something to consider. Then most importantly, confidentiality and data protection. How are you going to regulate that with your employees? What systems do you have in place to ensure security? What must the employee follow when they are working at home? Must they be separate from the family? If they walk away from the laptop, must the laptop be closed and locked at all times? They cannot have any hard copies of any confidential information. Everything is stored on the laptop, things like that. So yeah, confidentiality and data protection are at risk if the employees are working from home, just because there's other people in the vicinity that are not supposed to be privy to the information. Very important to protect that, especially in terms of POPI. If you're dealing with someone's personal information, POPI is very much there. So foreign employees with South African employees, what happens here? So if an international employee employs South African employees and they work remotely, are they bound by South African labor and tax laws? The short answer is yes. So when a foreign employer is based in another country and hires a South African to perform the work, yeah, even though it's for a country, it's for a company in a different country, they are still bound by the laws, the South African labor laws. If you are a foreign company or you're a foreign employer, you need to, it's best that you get on top of the labor laws in South Africa, so that you are not doing anything that violates that, because even though you're based in a different country, like I said, you're still going to be bound by our laws, yeah, unless your employment contract says otherwise. In very limited circumstances will the jurisdiction in the employment contracts take precedent over the labor laws here in South Africa, because if there's a dispute within a South African employee, how are they going to manage that dispute, and who do they go to? I mean, if the governing laws are in a different country, sorry. So it is best practice for a foreign employer to make sure they know the layers of the labor law setting in South Africa and take advice on various instances that they are unsure of before they employ South Africans to work for them, even though they're working remotely. Yeah. South Africans working, there's also, sorry, let me just regain my thoughts there. There's been this interesting thing that's come about in the budget speech earlier this year. While I'm not a tax specialist, I think this is something that needs to be kept in mind as a foreign employee. It's going to come into play later on down the line. I'm not sure when, but it will definitely come into play then. Following the budget speech in 2023, it seems as though SARS has their eyes now on foreign employers and may require foreign employers to register with them as employers. What this means is that the foreign company will they need to meet the payroll compliance obligations on behalf of the employees. And even though it's not been adopted yet, it is something that should definitely be kept in mind going forward. If you are a foreign company wanting to hire South Africans to work for your company, even though it's remotely. Yeah, that brings us to the end of the webinar. Let's see if there's any questions. Hi, Lukuzola, thanks for your questions. Are foreign employees bound to South African labor laws for all types of contract agreements or full-time employees? So that's a good question. Foreign companies are bound by South African labor laws for employees. If you're going to hire independent contractors, they are not considered employees in terms of the law. They would then be bound by whatever law you have in your independent contractor agreement and bound by the law of that country. But in terms of employees, you will be bound by South African law, and the employees will be entitled to the law, the laws, the entitlements and the rights afforded to them in terms of those laws. And as an employer, you'll have to follow the labor laws when it comes to dismissal, when it comes to retrenchments, it comes to bargaining councils, collective agreements, all of that may come up and may be an issue for you. Not an issue, but yeah. Hi, Elizabeth. I recently assisted a client with unfair dismissal dispute on Irish man. You're most welcome to pop me an email, Elizabeth, and we can discuss this further. I don't want to actually answer this here because it's, yeah, I feel like there's a lot more to delve into that before I can give you a proper answer. You're most welcome to email me. Let me just get my details up for you. You're welcome to either pop us an email at info@legalese.co.za, or you can pop me an email, rishni@legalese.co.za, and we can chat a little bit further about your question. Yeah, that's all from me in today, folks. If you have any other questions, oh no, Kuzola, sorry. I'll take one more question before I go. If I decide to hire a remote employee, when am I bound to provide them with equipment? Well, in general, an employer is bound to make sure that, just quickly, to make sure that they supply everything necessary for the employee to do their job. And if that means giving them the equipment, they may be obliged to do so. But you could also require them to have their own laptops. But as for systems, email addresses, like access to servers, access to documents and stuff, that is what you need to, that is what's also required in terms of providing the employer with the necessary equipment and resources. So while you may not need to give them like a full desktop with the fancy materials to do their job, you just need to give them the basics to allow them to perform the job adequately. And if you genuinely can't, you can, in certain circumstances, request that they use their own laptop, but the platforms that they use to do their job on their laptop must come from you. I hope that answers your question. You're welcome. Okay, cool. Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, you're most welcome to pop me an email. You can either send it to info@legalese.co.za, or you can send it to my personal email address, which is Rishni, my name, @legalese.co.za. I hope today was informative. Yeah, thank you so much for joining my webinar. Have a great day further, guys. Bye.